Welcome everyone to our 2016 webinar on Saturn retrograde in Sagittarius. Before we get started on tonight's material though, first of all, our good old housekeeping slides. Here at EAN, you can learn and study with us 3 different ways. Our free weekly audio podcasts, our Astro Library, and our Multimedia course. Here's a slide on our Astro Library, which prior to class, Leroy and I were talking about how it's probably just a little out of date. Leroy said he did a rough count, and in the last 2-3 years, 2 to 3 years, he says we've done I can't believe we've done 130 webinars.
130 plus webinars, and yeah, so these numbers are just kind of partial numbers and partial titles in the sections of the Astro Library. Kim and I have talked about using that section 3, the forecasting section 3, the relationship astrology section 3, to start to archive all these forecasting webinars immediately after the live event. So we'll continue to, we're going to work on that, and we'll have some updates about the Astro Library coming out shortly. But just know that we have a special that's been extended now through the end of the week, through Saturday. We had a lot of people overseas that wanted to get in on the 50% off any section of the Astro Library. That's the 6 to 12 month only sections of this enrollments to that Astro Library. So the long-term enrollments to the Astro Library, believe me, you'll need the time to get through the material anyway, but you can get that at half price now using a coupon code called, the coupon code is STREAMASTRO, all one word, STREAMASTRO. So apply that at checkout, save money on the premium or Section 1, Section 2, Section 3 Astro Library subscriptions.
Thank you, Leroy. Of course, we also have our multimedia course. We offer 3 different segments, and as you can see on your screen, segments 1 and 2 are available to get the materials only, the binders, the DVDs that you see on your screen, or you can get a digital version only, or you can get both the materials and the digital access with segments 1 and 2. If you are new to astrology or evolutionary astrology, you're always welcome to contact Leroy to help you with your learning path. He has been working with our programmer to make various changes for beginners, intermediate, advanced ways and interest of learning astrology. And so there is our phone number and his email if you'd like to contact him. And so again, what we are going to be working with here is Saturn's retrograde cycle in Sagittarius. As you can see on your screen, Saturn is going to go retrograde March 25th through August 13th. It will go retrograde at 1624 Sagittarius all the way back to 9 degrees 47 minutes Sag. Here was what I was talking about. As I have been prepping for class, I found a new photo of Saturn. This is a NASA photo from the Cassini orbiter that was taken July 19th, 2013, and the sun was behind Saturn. So what you're looking at is all of Saturn's rings eclipsing the sun, as seen from, again, Cassini orbiter. And even though you can't see this little dot, here's where the Earth and the Moon were at the time of this photograph. Here's where Venus was, here's where Mars was. But I just thought, oh, what a beautiful, beautiful photograph. You know, Saturn gets such a bad rap sometimes because it's the taskmaster. And yet, I think it takes some of the most beautiful planetary photos in our solar system with all of its rings. Here are the dates that Saturn is in Sag, from December 23rd, 14 to December 19th, 17. With that 3 months it was retrograde back in Sagittarius last year. So you can see we're full swing. We have this retrograde cycle right here again on these dates and degrees. And we will have one more Saturn retrograde cycle next year on your screen you can see the dates and degrees of that retrograde cycle coming up. So all in all, we're having 3 Saturn retrogrades in Sagittarius. Here's its synodic cycle with the Sun. Here is the conjunction last November. Here's when Saturn first went into shadow, December 19th at 9 Sag, with these little, forgot what you call these things, brackets. This was the first passage, pre-shadow, from 9 to 16. Here we are with the retrograde. The highlight of any planetary retrograde cycle is conjunction or opposition with the Sun, and here's where you can see this coming early June. It also happens to be the date that Venus will conjunct the Sun direct, and so more on that as we get into that slide. So here's the retrograde passage again, and then here is the post-shadow from Saturn direct to when it leaves its shadow of 1624 Sag in November. And then, of course, the next conjunction, which starts one more annual cycle with the Sun. Why planetary retrogrades? Of course, they are a geocentric or Earth-centered phenomenon of apparent motion. We all know that we travel around the Sun, but from our perspective on Earth, it looks like everything's traveling around us. And when those planets appear to go retrograde, it's always more powerful because they're always the closest that they will be to planet Earth when they are retrograde. And this is true for every single planetary retrograde, Mercury out through Pluto. What it does is it causes a withdrawal from the status quo to redefine any planetary archetype according to our own individual natural law. So a retrograde planet is non-static. It's in a perpetual state of evolving, or as we know from the words, reviewing, re-evaluating, reconsidering, looking at everything again. Now the sign in the house that the transiting planet is moving through will define how the retrograde is manifesting or appearing, and the opposite sign in house of that planetary retrograde will give us the clarity, the answers, the objectivity. And again, answers to retrograde lessons always come from within ourselves. Here's a visual of it. As you can see here, Earth, the blue symbol, is between the Sun and the Saturn, so Saturn's closest to Earth versus when it conjuncts the Sun over on this side. And as you follow the arrows, you can see how the planets make that passage in the sky. Here's stationary retrograde, the retrograde period, stationary direct, moving forward again. So you can see those 3 passages that the planetary retrograde makes. A little bit of astronomy. Saturn's revolution around the Sun is 29.5 years. Depending on how its revolution is going in our world or the chart, it takes anywhere from 28 to 29.5 years to evolve around the zodiac. This also is due to its retrograde cycles as well. Approximately 2.5 years in a sign. Retrograde cycle once a year, 140 days. Its stationary period is 5 days standing still when it turns retrograde, and 5 days standing still when it turns direct. So as we record this class, 2 days, 2.5 days before Saturn goes retrograde, we are entering that stationary retrograde period. Now Saturn, like Earth and Jupiter, is not perfectly round. It is wider in the middle and it is more narrow at its top and bottom, the polarities. Second largest planet in our solar system after Jupiter, and it is a gas giant like Jupiter. Saturn does not have much gravity. I thought this is an interesting thing to recognize in its astronomy. If you look at Saturn, you know, the interpretation of astrology behind it is, you know, as we'll learn in future slides, it's authority, it's responsibility, it's, you know, being real. You would think of it as being, we do think of it as being a heavy planet. However, it is the least dense planet in our solar system because it's made up of mostly hydrogen and helium, which are two of the lightest elements in the universe. So it does not have very much gravity on that planet if we were to visit it. Isn't that interesting? We'd all be taller there, and if we jumped, we could jump higher. Now, Saturn, Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune all have rings. Remember that picture I showed you of Saturn's rings? Its rings are basically only a half a mile thick. There are 7 major categories of these rings. They're made up of ice, dust, rocks. These rings are held in place by the fact that Saturn has 53 official moons and 9 unofficial moons that orbit it. Its largest moon, Titan, is the second largest moon in the solar system after our own moon. And it is the gravity of these moons that cause the gap in between the rings. I don't have this in here, but as I review this with you, I bet you anything there was another ancient planetary collision with Saturn, and all of its rings are the remnants of that old planet that collided with Saturn. In mythology, Saturn was the Roman god of agriculture. He was called Cronus by the Greeks. Saturn is the son of Uranus, the father of Jupiter. Saturn overthrew his father, Uranus, to become king of the gods, but then his son Jupiter overthrew him. Just a few tidbits on mythology. Saturn is known as Father Time. The archetype of Saturn, it's the passive polarity, the cardinal modality, and the earth element. In evolutionary astrology, we know it as the structure of the individuated consciousness. And it's not just Saturn alone. When we want to find this for ourselves in our own chart, we'll look by Saturn natally, house, sign, aspects. Is it retrograde? We will look for the location of Capricorn in a chart. What house cusps does Capricorn rule? We'll look at the 10th house. We'll look at the sign on that cusp, and we'll look at its planetary ruler by its own house sign aspects. And all of this together will create that structure of consciousness for us, the boundaries of consciousness as an individual. And so every other planetary archetype, be it Mercury, Venus, Mars, be it the outer planets, they all become filtered and defined by Saturn. And Saturn and its structure of the individuated consciousness is always attempting to suppress the unconsciousness. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and you could include Chiron in here as well if you would like. Saturn is the principle of conditioning, familial, social, religious, resources, anything in our world that conditions us as we're growing up and as we become an adult is known as our environmental conditionings. Saturn is the maturation process relative to those environmental conditionings. And these environmental conditionings just don't happen out of the blue. Whatever we've been prior to this lifetime has created the environment prior to incarnating that has us coming into specific familial or religious or other kinds of environments. Saturn is judgments relative to the standard of right-wrong conduct, and those get conditioned as well by our environment. Saturn is our gender, hormonal, childhood, and parenting issues. It is known as the boundaries of space-time. It is linear time with all of its related mortality issues. It is known in basic psychology that it is around 7-8 years of age that children really finally become able to know the difference between mortality, life, death. You ask a 3-year-old where daddy goes if he's passed away, they're going to be able to recite something. They may not necessarily know what it means. Saturn is the archetype of self-responsibility, which means accepting absolute responsibility for our own actions, efforts, and results. No blaming anybody else. No blaming the silver spoon or the pauper. No blaming anything in our environment. In other words, to grow out of those conditionings, which Saturn Retrograde is all about. It is the archetype of self-determination, or the discipline to take charge of our life within society. And an extension of that is what we know as career. Saturn, Capricorn, 10th house, these are interchangeable archetypes. They are the accumulation of all of our resources and the management of them. It is authority, social positions of leadership, power, and control. Saturn is also the principle of involution, compression, and depression, when our outer reality and circumstances no longer serve our soul. So again, one of the most natural archetypes to Saturn is involution. This is the passive polarity, energy returning back to center. And this is our turning inward when something in our life isn't working. So when Saturn turns retrograde, regardless of the sign or house it's transiting, we are orientated towards turning inward, towards compressing what no longer works out there, towards some degree of letdown or depression that then has us questioning what is it that needs to change about our outer reality. Now, I always liked this little tidbit from Alexander Rupert T. in his book Cycles of Becoming. It is a forecasting book. It was republished a few years ago. If you can still get a copy of it, I still find it to be a good resource from time to time. Alexander always said the first Saturn cycle, that first 28, 29 years around our chart, was addressing the past and cleaning up our karma. And if we didn't, we'd have a pretty tough Saturn return. The second Saturn return cycle represents the present and productivity. Kim Marie is having 3 passages of her Saturn in Sagittarius return. I already had the first passage. I have 2 to go. And then I'll be entering into my 3rd Saturn cycle, which is known as the future and the ability to acquire and share the wisdom of everything we've learned in this space-time medium. Another good book, actually any books by Dane Rudier are good. And here's a link to that in case you'd like to look at this book. And chances are this one you can purchase out there, used off of Amazon. Many of his books are still in print and republished. Now, to talk about Saturn at all this year is to really look at what I've termed this spiritual T-square. I want you to recognize here that we're looking at 4 different aspects in this 2-year time period. summer 2015, fall of 2017. 3 out of these 4 aspects involve Saturn. Well, there's 5 if you include the 1 Jupiter opposition to Neptune. But Jupiter's last quarter squares to Saturn, we're still in the midst of those. You can see we're having one today as we record this class. We also have Saturn in process of making 3 last quarter squares to Neptune. And we have Saturn making 3 last quarter squares to Chiron next year. Or how many, maybe I'm wrong, maybe there's 5 of them that are going on. As I'm looking at this, Saturn has 1, Jupiter has 1, 2, 3, and Saturn has 1, 2. Yes, I think there's 5. You get my point. Saturn's involved here quite heavily. I have more on these individual slides, but as you look at all of these dates that are going on, and they're either oppositions or they're last quarter squares, what we're really working through right now is all of our philosophical differences over how to address the many issues we are pondering in our world. And to me, what's really coming through is all these various groups of people on planet Earth. And as a matter of fact, right now, another one that's missing from this list is national. You look at these terrorist groups that's in the news right now, religious groups which get involved with the terrorist groups. Look at political groups with the U.S. presidential election, environmental groups, gender issues that are continuing to go on, national issues with how, the U.S. considers that European countries are so far behind on security issues as we see. So we have all of these differences on how various groups look at things. And we have discussions, if not outright fighting, over who's right, who's wrong, who's doing it better, whose truth is right. And whatever way you're looking at it, what it comes down to is it me versus you, us versus them, or are we pondering how to get along? Where's the common ground? And so as Saturn moves through this 4-month retrograde cycle, it opens us up to looking at it from larger perspectives. Again, consciousness is orientated to the young conscious. Everything below the surface pops into our conscious mind with Saturn retrograde. And so we'll find it through the news, we'll find it through conversations, we'll find it through any groups we participate in, we find it through walking the dog and having a conversation with a neighbor. And what we're looking at here is the potential for different faiths and beliefs of all kinds to find a common ground, the global village, to realize we are all in this together. Common example of this is the conservative U.S. presidential candidates who want to start increasing policing of any Muslims in the U.S. versus the Democratic presidential candidates going, wait a minute, those are the best people to turn to for help in what's going on in our world, for finding a wounded soul such as a terrorist. And that's exactly what happened over in Belgium. The taxi driver who dropped off the 3 terrorists with their suitcases recognized how heavy they were, and then when he saw pictures on TV, went to the cops to give what information he could. So again, we're really finding the spiritual T-square is just in subtle but powerful ways, drawing lines or circles. Now, the distortions of this again are going to be increasing judgments, Saturn, around others, looking at our differences rather than what's in common between all of us. Now, I think that one of the most interesting things about Saturn throughout this year is the fact, and I'll show you the chart afterward, the next slide, but Saturn is within a 10-degree orb on either side of the nodes from mid-January of 2016 all the way through the end of November 2016. In other words, Saturn is squaring the nodes of the moon all through 2016. And what's going on this year is the potential to create skip steps, as we call it in EA. Skip steps with everything I mentioned about the Saturn archetype in the previous slides. Growing up, facing reality, accepting self-responsibility, looking at that whole authoritarian issue, power over under with others, issuing judgments, martyrdom, truth versus lies, religious extremism, exaggerations. Take any key word you can think of for Saturn and add on any key word you can think of with Sagittarius, and we can create skip steps and future lessons in regards to this. You could even add on every keyword and archetype for South Node in Pisces, North Node in Virgo. We have an entire mini generation of souls born in 2016 who are coming in with Saturn square the nodes from previous lives. It just happens that it's where the nodes are placed and Saturn going retrograde. Saturn is not always square the nodes a whole year. Whenever this happens, once every 9 years on either side of the 19-year nodal axis cycle. It just is happening to line up with this particular retrograde cycle to create a whole year of it. And so with Saturn retrograde, can we throw off creating skip steps in our own life with responsibility and beliefs? And what is our role to do this year on planet Earth? Now, the North Node is the resolution node in this lineup, and so it is asking us to analyze Virgo and search Jupiter with that North Node. Search for truth. To do those fact checks. This is my buzzword for this class, and you're probably seeing it out there if you're a United States citizen as well. What's the fact and what's hearsay and propaganda and the demagoguery or whatever that word is. You get the point of what I'm saying. We need to reach for that North Node. And so while Jupiter's last quarter squares Saturn and letting go, it's still conjunct that North Node, leading us forward to search and intuit what is real and truth for us, and what is our role and our responsibility here on planet Earth, and what is not ours to do if we've been overly responsible with our Saturn archetype. Here's the chart. Saturn doesn't actually square the nodes until October 7th of 2016. And as you can see, I do 0 Aries when I want to really make it generic for all of us. Look at this chart when Saturn's exactly square the nodes. We still have Neptune conjunct that South Node. We still have Chiron. Where are we in denial and avoidance? Look at this right here, this stellium of planets, Moon and Mars, balsamic Pluto. Here's these 3 planets. Jupiter's moved on into Libra. Right here, potential for some upsets in the U.S. presidential race. Why? This stellium, this stellium, this stellium, And these guys, Saturn square the nodes right here. So here's some of the things we could look at. Two-faced behaviors, extremes of lies, exposures of lies, power grabs, previous power grabs coming home to roost, disillusionment, speaking up for truth as part of the evolution, making the honest effort, sharing power, including all groups. All of this can be emphasized through this 4-month Saturn retrograde because it's going to be within orb of squaring the nodes throughout its retrograde cycle. Now, back to these planetary retrogrades in general. In EA, in life, we look at EA as natural law. As we look at life out there, there's this principle of psychological compensation, which is being out of sync with who you naturally are. And most of us have these compensations in order to get along and appear normal in consensus society. It's really hard to step out of it even when you're individuating and spirituating. And these compensations can take place anywhere there is a dissatisfaction in our life. And so you start to look at someone's chart to get some idea of where we buy into status quo and compensate for any planetary archetype. Exception would be planetary retrogrades natally because you're coming in trying to throw it off. But you'd look to that archetype by its sign, house, aspects, evolutionary state of the soul, all evolutionary states, the environmental conditionings. That will again show you where we are compensating to some degree. And when any planet goes retrograde, that is the Yahoo Alleluia time to break free and align with our own individual natural laws and principles. Now, if we have a natal planet retrograde, we're trying to throw off these compensations throughout the lifetime, even if it goes direct by progression. When a transiting planet goes retrograde, then individually and all of us collectively, we're trying to throw off the status quo, the conditionings, the compensations of whatever is pertaining to that particular planet. If you have a natal planet retrograde and it goes retrograde by transit, you're going to have a temporary harmony and balance. For instance, any of you who were born with Saturn retrograde, during the 4 months it's retrograde, it goes smoother for you because you're throwing things off. And I just got to speak up, Leroy. We have a young adult with Saturn retrograde. It's his only Saturn retrograde planet. And I have been avoiding my 20-year-old's room for the last 2-3 months. And I finally opened up the windows for fresh air because it was warm enough. And I was pretty blunt and saying, if you don't clean that room, you need to look for a new place to live. And I didn't yell, but I said it in such a way that the eyeballs got big and he realized, Mom's serious. And in the last 2 days, I think he might have his room clean by the time Saturn goes retrograde. And I'm thinking, so maybe he can really make some progress with that maturation factor as transiting Saturn retrograde lines up with his natal Saturn retrograde. He can be throwing off his old conditioning factors and maybe 5 minutes a day to clean his room. When you're born with these natal planets stationary retrograde or direct, everything is magnified. If you're born with a planet stationary retrograde, it's hard to move that archetype forward because you really have to throw things off. And if you're born with any planet getting ready to turn direct at the end of a retrograde cycle, this is the universe pushing you forward. You have no choice but to move with that archetype. Now, Saturn retrograde, this is true for any planet retrograde in general. Any planetary retrograde is always going to be related back to the natal archetype by sign, house, and aspects. So think for a moment, where do you have Saturn natally? What kind of aspect is transiting Saturn 9 to 16 degrees Sagittarius making in your chart? Again, I get Saturn over my natal Sag at 12 degrees 3 times. My 3-second Saturn returns. Yahoo, I'm waiting for those rewards, as Alexander Ruperti says. But just think back to your natal archetype and what are you having to throw off relative to Saturn's retrograde transit. And relative to Saturn specifically, there will always be the theme of throwing off conditioning patterns as well as throwing open the door to the unconsciousness or the outer planets. And in this regard, I included Chiron. Here's the 4 outer planetary archetypes. And so all of these archetypes will be beep, 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 throwing things up into consciousness as Saturn is making room to look at things from deeper, broader perspectives. Saturn retrograde is only a bummer when we're not willing to throw off our conditioning. If we're clinging to ideals that are not in our highest best good, if we're refusing to grow up and be responsible, if we're denying taking charge of our career, Saturn retrograde, it has a tendency to be a bit of a tougher retrograde. But it's not an absolute, and it's only there when we're not willing to let go. So what are you being asked to let go of this week? These 2 weeks, the month of March, as Saturn has slowed down, the month of April, as it starts to really reverse over these 16 to 9 degrees Sagittarius. What house is that falling in with your chart? Is it in the 5th house and you're a parent and you're having to throw off doing everything for your children? Is Saturn in Sagittarius retrograde in the 7th house and you're having to throw off some type of unequal relating patterns in your life? Is Saturn in Sag retrograde in the 2nd and you're having to throw off hoarding or just all the stuff that you create in your world, all the accumulations in your world that just no longer serve you anymore? Just take some time to reflect on this in general. So, Saturn retrograde in Sagittarius, throwing off old structures of consciousness relative to philosophical, spiritual, religious conditionings. Sagittarius. We're opening up to a quest to know truth. How does it reflect and manifest in my world, in the world in general? Can we open up and understand the many paths home to universal timeless truth? It is a time period to align with our own inner personal truth, and it is a time period to align our own inner truth with universal truth. Truth is simple, it's we humans who complicate it. and Sagittarius polarity Gemini. Saturn retrograde points to Gemini. And so we're going to either have confusion, we're not wanting to open up. We could have that duality or alignment. The intent is to have a curiosity about something, to have open-mindedness to how we're looking at something versus some of the consensus stuff we have going on today, which is just intensifying, drawing lines in the sand. Those are going to be distortions of Saturn retrograde in Sag when we get religious with defending our point of view, Gemini. Here's a little example for you. I mentioned this on our podcast, I think. Here's a chart for the state of South Dakota. It has Sag on the midheaven at 13 degrees. And we were I don't know if we were the only state to introduce the legislation, but we have super Republican majorities in both our Senate and House, and we were the first state to pass a bathroom bill, which says that transgender people had to use the public restroom orientated to their gender at birth. We did it specifically to schools, not all public bathrooms. And our governor said he would sign the bill. And so the transgender community rose up, as well as several, let's say, level-headed citizens. And he vetoed that bill March 1st. We had several transgender citizens travel to our state capital. They all met with our governor, and he literally changed his mind and said that he didn't see a need for this type of a bill. And so there is an example of Saturn and Sag open-minded towards the consideration of somebody else and expanding into a broader understanding rather than drawing a line in the sand. So, Saturn retrograde in Sag, it is evolving our standards of what we consider to be right, wrong conduct in any area of life, not just philosophy and religion, but with government, with gender, with parenting, with intimate relationships, with work and career, with any area of life. And so individuals, societies, and governments all have a potential to recognize any limitation in any structure and replace rigidity with flexibility. It's not a guarantee it will happen, but this is the intent. It also means to have a degree of willingness to change with the times. One of the things that's happening in the U.S., and thank you international listeners for allowing my U.S. examples, is that the Supreme Court Justice who recently died unexpectedly was known as an originalist, which means his belief and his practice as a judge, the highest judge in our land, Supreme Court Justice, was to interpret the Constitution as our founding fathers originally wrote it and meant it, versus evolving with the times. And I forget what that term was, opposite or instead of originalist. It meant that the Constitution is a living, breathing thing. Look at how we have had the Bill of Rights, which brought through how many amendments to the Constitution have we had so far? I don't remember what the number is. Let's just say 17. I don't remember. But I think it's the, we actually, one of those amendments was creating a federal income tax, and we didn't pass that till we created private central banking in our country back in the early 1900s. One of the amendments to change the Constitution was the one of equal rights for women. That one was never ratified by a majority of states in our country. And so this is the example of Saturn in Sag, and especially retrograde, is a degree of willingness to change with the times. Reflect for a moment on your own personal world. Transiting Saturn in Sag relative to a house, your house. And then how does that reflect back to your natal Saturn? Where are you having to evolve and be flexible on a very personal, intimate level? I find that when, go ahead.
There's actually 27 amendments in the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, if you can hear me.
Thank you. Yes, I can.
Yeah,
yes,
27 total. And it's a very Saturnian thing because it's almost, I mean, what else could you compare it to? I suppose, the 10 Commandments in a way. I mean, it's the 27 commandments to the amendments to the Constitution, which is some level of commandment to the citizens of the United States.
We don't have any 27 amendments to the 10 Commandments.
No, I was trying to draw. I guess it's not very a secular analogy to a very spiritual or religious theme. Sorry about that.
I'm making the joke, but we get the point. Thank you for that.
Rules are rules.
And there's always an exception to the rule.
Of course.
Well, we also have throughout Saturn and Sag, but intensified when it's retrograde, an exposure of truth versus lies in any area of life. Again, religion, government, media, financial, personal lies within ourselves. One of the things about Sag is Sagittarius Jupiter in the 9th house will deal with where we have personal compensations, where we're not being honest with ourselves. And so this Saturn retrograde is requiring us to have a real deep inner honesty with ourselves. Where are we lying to ourselves? And then where are we doing it with others in our life? Now the fear or distortion is buying into the lie or the status quo in order to feel secure. Just look at all of the U.S. citizens buying into Donald Trump and his statement of the day. All the citizens buying into racism in the U.S., buying into the fears that everyone who is a Muslim in the U.S. is a terrorist. That can be intensified during this retrograde. But think and reflect, where are you buying into some of your own personal lies? When what we really need to be doing is questioning what we know. Or as you've many times heard me say with one of my great cliches, what would you have me know, source? What would you have me know, source? For instance, here's a couple of quotes for you. Ted Cruz, either today or yesterday, in response to the Belgium terrorist attack. We need to empower law enforcement to patrol and secure Muslim neighborhoods before they become radicalized. The days of the United States voluntarily surrendering to the enemy to show how progressive and enlightened we are at an end. Versus Philippa Gregory. If you don't know who she is a British author, and she is a fictional author, most famous for the other Boleyn woman or the other Boleyn girl. She writes a lot on the Tudor Times. She did the Red Queen, the White Queen. She's a favorite fiction author of mine. She posted on Facebook today, thinking of everyone of all faiths in Belgium and hoping as Christians prepare for Easter that we all remember the message of forgiveness. Nodal axis in Virgo Pisces, anyone? Can you just see in these statements the extremes of Saturn in Sag and the two directions we could be opening up conversations as it turns retrograde, intensifying the closed-mindedness or opening up with further open-mindedness. Now, South Node in Pisces, I do not mean we do not have a right to defend ourselves. Your freedom ends at my nose, as I say. But we are really being asked to have some deep philosophical conversations as a planet, as countries, and that comes down into ourselves as well, individually. Where do you draw lines in the sand versus ask question and consider something else? This retrograde cycle is about throwing off our compensations and standing in the authenticity of ourself, as I said before. It's learning to be in integrity with ourself and with others. And so when Saturn's retrograde in Sag, pointing towards the Gemini polarity point, Gemini is known for finding the weakest link in any argument. And so Gemini's role here can be helping us really recognize BS when somebody's exaggerating or when somebody's outright lying. Gemini is the little voice in our head that says, oh, wait a minute, something doesn't sound quite right here. I need to take another look at this. I need some more facts. I need some more information before I really know where I'm at. And of course, just evolving that whole issue of self-responsibility and self-determination in general with Saturn retrograde. And so that these two, self-responsibility, self-determination, they feed into the whole integrity thing with ourself. Sagittarius, Jupiter, 9th house, really like to get into more is better. And so with this retrograde, it always is asking us to let go of anything that is in excess, behaviors, foods, drinks, whatever. You know, I just use these examples right here of making healthy choices. But excess can be excess of beliefs. Thinking we're right, everybody else is wrong, and, you know, basically throwing up over everybody else and their opinion, Gemini polarity. It can be excess of, you know, wanting to party. It can be excess of communications, exaggerating anything and everything with no thought for facts and truth. And as a matter of fact, I have an example of that. Donald Trump, true or false? I don't know if you want me to read all these statements. Ariana Huffington is unattractive both inside and out. I fully understand why her former husband left her for a man. He made a good decision. True or false? I will build a great wall, and nobody builds walls better than me, believe me. And I'll build them very inexpensively. I will build a great, great wall on our southern border, and I will make Mexico pay for that wall. Mark my words. True or false? The beauty of me is that I'm very rich. My fingers are long and beautiful, as it has been well documented are various other parts of my body. Now that one's got some news time here in the last few weeks. All of the women on The Apprentice flirted with me, consciously or unconsciously. That's to be expected. One of the key problems today is that politics is such a disgrace. Good people don't go into government. Every single one of these are true quotes made by Donald Trump. Any example of Sagittarius exaggerations? How many of these things do you think are actually true, or are they just words? We don't have to go any further with this, but I thought it would just be a nice little example for you. Saturn retrograde in Sagittarius. One of the things that is relative to the archetype of Sag, third house, and ruler Jupiter is alienation. And when we experience that alienation, it is to help us break free from our compensations, from our conditionings, and broaden our understanding of life and who we naturally are. Again, to step into that authenticity. It also happens to help us understand truth and to speak our truth, to evolve the whole essence of language. And so when Saturn goes retrograde in Sag, we may feel perhaps a little more alienation as the impetus to have us again stand in our truth, be real. It will include evolving the whole process of education, publishing, all of those types of issues, speaking and writing, things being discovered in that area, things evolving in that area. It will have us learning to trust our intuition versus the status quo and whatever those standards of conduct are. Can you trust that gut when it speaks to you? How many of you have come through your own Saturnian conditionings to such a degree that you compensate and suppress your own intuition? We all naturally have it, and many of us are taught to suppress it. And Saturn retrograde is the time to bring it back, and especially retrograde in Sagittarius. And so I thought, speaking of all the education and publishing issues evolving, there is a new journal of evolutionary astrology coming out. It will be published on a quarterly basis. I have an article in there. I put in the first so many words. I wrote an article on Mars in the spirit of initiation. The theme of the first article was Mars, Aries in the first house. And so you can see the beginning of that article. Stay tuned. We're not the publishers of it. As it becomes available for publication, it will be a printed journal, and it will be digitized as well. We'll sign up for our weekly newsletter with our free podcasts, because as it becomes available, we will let you know how you can subscribe to this quarterly journal. I'm already in process of writing an article for the next edition of this journal that'll be coming out. Hopefully it will be printed and published next month in April. So isn't this a nice example of Saturn in Sagittarius and a publication coming out devoted entirely to the Jeffrey Wolf Green method of evolutionary astrology. First issue published, Saturn Retrograde. And there were, what did they say? I think there were this first journal, I think there were over 30 authors in the first journal. So, Gemini, polarity point, and a variety of opinions on evolutionary astrology. Saturn retrograde in Sag, of course, will bring up the whole issue of language and communication lessons. Sagittarius, Gemini. Do I say one more time? Truth versus lies exposed. Gemini polarity will find the weakest link. We must be careful of the whole issue of miscommunications and the consequences that can come from that. You might want to take the time to really communicate more than once with anybody you're wanting to speak to. With the Gemini polarity point, you could almost consider this Saturn retrograde just like a Mercury retrograde. This is what I think you said. Is this what you actually meant? Or did you mean something else? Take the time to really listen. Are you hearing what somebody is saying? Can you hear the imprint or message of what they're trying to say beyond the words? Jupiter and its rulership of Sag in the 9th house teaches us to speak in ways that others can understand. And so Saturn retrograde, if you have issues with people really understanding you, now's the time to make the effort and to make multiple communication efforts until you're on the same page with whomever about whatever. And of course, I love this one, seeking to understand first. And you see the Larry King quote here. I remind myself every morning, nothing I say this day will teach me anything. So if I'm going to learn, I must do it by listening. And in case you don't know, Larry King had a radio show for decades with a variety of people he interviewed, be they political or entertainment or religious or, everything in between. What do we have going on here in the U.S.? The need for organizations to fact-check our politicians. In other words, what's really coming through with this political election, as you saw with my Donald Trump quotes as one example, but he's not the only one. I would say almost every one of the politicians are having fact checks done on them, and they all will have a little point here or there. I have no idea what the percentages are, but if we look at the Donald Trumps of the world, and excuse me, I'm putting my prejudices out there, what comes out of his mouth that is truth. And if Bernie Sanders says it, it's always truth, unless he didn't have a chance to study the issue before he was asked the question. But I just listed a few of the organizations that are out there that are doing fact checks. Even the Associated Press, one of the most mainstream consensus organizations in the U.S., puts out a facts check after a presidential debate. Here's my little cartoon. If you can't see this, quickie news. The nice thing about being a reporter nowadays is you don't have to take the time to do research or check resources. Sag, Gemini. Now, moving into the planetary aspects with Saturn, I'll try and get through these as a little bit faster for all of you, and hopefully this will help you in looking at some of these retrograde aspects. This year, all three of the inner planets, Venus, Sun, and Mercury, have oppositions to Saturn retrograde. Remember earlier I said at the highlight of the Saturn retrograde cycle with the Sun, which is June 3rd, 13 degrees, Gemini, Sag, Venus that same day also is going to oppose Saturn, almost exact. So we're going to have Venus and Sun conjunct at 13 Gemini, opposing Saturn at 13 Sag, early June. This is the highlight of the Saturn retrograde cycle. If you have any confusion, if you have any of the Saturnian involutions going on, the depression, the letdown, the I can't figure it out, what's it all mean? This is the time period to ask for truth to be revealed. Throughout June, but especially right here in early June. What would you have me know, Source? Show me the truth. Show me the truth. And I'm always one of those saying that if you are as honest as you can be, anybody who's trying to lie to you will have that lie exposed, because through the law of attraction, the energy just doesn't vibe. And I won't go into the examples of the times that I've had situations where people's, games or lies have been exposed because they were playing games, but I was trying to get into evolutionary astrology for 30 years, and it's like, okay, just tell the truth, okay? Makes life easier. And so this is the time period to have your personal truth and values revealed. This is a time period to quest to know truth as deeply as possible. It will have us throwing off old realities and beliefs that no longer match our values. And it will ask you to deal with anywhere you have incongruency in your life. And of course, I need to just have truth versus lies on every slide of this PowerPoint show, because here it is. This is the big theme. We'll also bring up some fairness and equality issues with these oppositions as well. Now Mercury, here's the aspects Mercury makes while Saturn is retrograde, from waxing trines to a waning square. So communications on these dates may have some surprises, maybe some polarities and standoffs. We have two trines that are going to go on here. Time for mediation or lies and the con artist. And these will be time periods to ask, are you walking your talk? Here's the Venus. Venus is pretty interesting with this Saturn retrograde. I put this in here. I think this retrograde is going to carry the themes of values and what matters most in life. Because the day Saturn turns retrograde, Venus is having a first quarter square with Saturn retrograde. I want to make a note of this one. I didn't put this in here. I'm going to put a stationary retrograde in this slide point right here, because again, this is the day Saturn goes retrograde. Here's Venus first quarter square. Waxing trine, that opposition we talked about with the conjunction with the Sun, waning trine, and the day that Saturn goes direct, Venus has a last quarter square. So there is the possibility that this retrograde is going to bring relationship crises, inner and outer. The relationship we have with our source, with our self, between us and source, and relationships we have with other people outside of ourselves. So we're really having to deepen self-love, be honest with ourselves in regards to loving ourselves, and then see if we can reflect that outwardly. And so it will also bring up that excluding versus including theme in our world very strongly. So Venus is almost like riding along with Saturn. Crises in action, crises in consciousness here throughout the whole retrograde cycle. What do I value? What is important to me? Do you value honesty? Or do you value the end justifies the means? I want to win the election. I'll say whatever I need to say here in the United States. I want to blow up the world. I'll do whatever I need to do. It is more important to me that I have real, honest relationships with people. And I'll have a relationship with myself first if someone in my world is lying to me. So don't discount Venus throughout this. And you may want to just watch these dates here and what happens for you in relationships on these dates. Mars is another interesting one with this retrograde cycle. Mars made a waning semi-square, 315-degree mark. It moved into balsamic phase to Saturn back at Christmas. And so for 8 months here, Mars is balsamic phase to Saturn. And Mars is going to have a retrograde cycle in early Sag to Jupiter, April 17th to June 29th, which, by the way, retrograde class on that next month. Stay tuned. I'll show you the slide on the dates for that retrograde. But look at this. Mars-Saturn. Mars is a 2-year cycle with all the outer planets. And Mars to Saturn is our desires and going after them. The responsibility to achieve our goals and desires. And so Mars, balsamic Saturn, well, that doesn't work anymore. Well, that doesn't work anymore. Do you have rewards going on with all of the efforts you've made in the last year from Mars, Saturn? Or is everything falling apart for you? Does nothing seem to move forward? If we look at this on a generic, mundane level, it can be hard to move things forward because it's balsamic phase. Let it go. Resolve it. Bring it to completion. Address the karma. Really search for deeper understandings. Those are all words for balsamic phase between any planet. And so in this case, with the Saturn retrograde for 4 of these 8 months, with a Mars retrograde for 2.5 of these 8 months, they're balsamic with each other. Review, 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 actions. This may be why we might have a long U.S. presidential nomination for both the Republicans and the Democrats. Here are the dates that they start their conventions to name their nominee. It'll be after the Mars retrograde. However, Saturn will still be retrograde, moving through those, probably, I'm going to guess 11, 10 degrees Sagittarius. Now, anytime Mars goes in, it was in Scorpio, here was the first one, or goes back to Scorpio, then the power struggles will come up. It was in balsamic phase through this time period here. It'll be back, it'll still be balsamic phase during these dates. These are the dates that Mars will be retrograding back into Scorpio again and then direct in Scorpio. So more power struggles can be happening here. So Mars will be pretty active with the Saturn retrograde as well. And whenever something just won't quite move forward for you, take the time to look at it again. What would you have me know, Source? What would you have me do? Remember that spiritual T-square? Well, here it is with Jupiter, Chiron, and Saturn. Here is the date that Jupiter is in exact conjunction to the North Node, right on the summer solstice, right around it. June 20th of 2016, see Saturn within orb of squaring the nodes. And even though Jupiter only opposes Neptune one time, it's within orb. You can see during this conjunction of Jupiter North Node, we can also bring in the fact that Mercury during that day is activating a Grand Cross. This could be another time period where things are excitable on planet Earth. Old manifestations and realities fading away, crises themes in all areas of life to affect evolution, lies and denials exposed. We must re-examine belief structures, where we are fearing change. How open-minded can we be in moving forward? Every single one of these themes are emphasized while Saturn is retrograde. And Saturn will be retrograde when Jupiter makes this conjunction to the North Node. So I just wanted to kind of give you a visual on this as we then move into, here are the time periods that Jupiter makes these last quarter squares to Saturn. We're in the midst of the second one right here on the lunar eclipse taking place. Last quarter squares is crises in consciousness. And a lot of this is going to revolve around our differing values individually and collectively. This could include our beliefs as well. But Jupiter last quarter square Saturn generically is always old realities crumbling. Wherever we're no longer supportable and evolving. Wherever these realities are not supportable or moving forward, they're going to break down. What we want to look for is an ability to analyze and intuit the truth. Where is my world not working? You know, Jupiter-Saturn is a 20-year cycle. You can see the two conjunctions there on your screen for you. Most of us have an ability to grasp. This is the boundaries of consciousness. Jupiter-Saturn are the social planets in traditional astrology. And Jupiter's growth, Saturn's decay. Most of us can grasp these 20-year cycles of building and letting go. So what have you been building over the last 15 years or so that isn't quite working the way you've done it up to this point? It may not be that it has to leave your life, but it has to, how you value it, how you work with it is changing. You're having to address something. You're having to look at it differently. And then how do you change your relationship to it? How do you change your perspective to it? For some of us, it literally may be something that doesn't work anymore, up to and including career. Jupiter in Virgo and Saturn as an archetype itself. We're all being asked to expand our beliefs wherever we feel confused or wherever we feel rigid. We talked about that theme yet? Just reflect. Where is it happening for you on a very personal level that you are speaking and talking and analyzing and pondering with those in your life, and where things are having to change for you? You know, for me, part of what I'm working through is communicating with my two sisters. I'm the oldest of three, about the possibility that over the next 5 years, the last 5 years of this Jupiter-Saturn cycle, that us three girls may be needing to help my mother with taking care of my father in early dementia. We can see him moving towards Alzheimer's. And, you know, I've kind of thought, 5 years, that might be a time to ponder that. There are other aspects in my chart leading me to this, but, you know, talking to my sisters and saying that it may not work for us to have mom and dad across the state from us. We may need to move them closer to us. 2 out of 3 sisters live in the same community. Mom, dad, baby sister live in another community, and baby sister is not always of the health that she may not be able to take care of them. So old realities that you're just pondering. It can be, you know, anything and everything. It can relate to resources from this initial conjunction back here in Taurus. This conjunction opposed my 10th house moon in Scorpio. Familial issues, dealing with taking care of your parents. Pondering that, Virgo Sag. Saturn will be making its last quarter squares to Chiron. It won't make the first one till the end of this year, so this retrograde cycle will be over, but it will have the last one during the next retrograde cycle right here with Saturn. So I thought I would include this for you. Again, last quarter, crises in consciousness, Sag Pisces, truth versus lies, finishing up an old woundedness cycle with Chiron in Pisces, victim or co-creator. I really feel that Chiron in Pisces and Neptune in Pisces spend all the mutable signs, but these two in Pisces have really been bringing up climate change issues and awareness, either denial or opening up. The potential here with the last quarter square to these two planets is an evolution of universal truth, really broadening our understandings, especially when we can step out of any sense of victimization and understand natural spiritual laws and principles, which are so much the foundation of evolutionary astrology. How is this working for you? Even though they don't have that first square until after this next retrograde cycle, they're moving towards this. The insights are coming through during this time period. Saturn with Uranus. Remember last year Saturn had 3 waning sesquisquadrates to Uranus. It moved from full phase to disseminating phase. Next year, it's going to have 3 waning trines. The first one will come this year. So I brought this one in too. You know, here's where we're having the controls versus freedoms. And look at how we're looking at various religious and government controls going on. I mean, look at how, you know, this issue of abandoning liberty versus feeling safe will come through. And what we have to be careful with these waning trines is things being brought through that we really weren't told the truth about. could have technological breakthroughs. We could have good deepenings of our individual path. Again, this is in process, even if nothing is direct throughout this retrograde. It'll be active next year's retrograde. We do have Saturn making 3 last quarter squares to Neptune. We've already had the first one. Look at here where the second one will come, third one. Social and religious conflicts over who is right and who is wrong. Getting that theme yet? This can be some disillusionment, depression, denial, avoidance, Saturn involutions. Neptune also can be involuting. It is passive polarity. Sagittarius is a mutable sign. Pisces is a mutable sign. Both of these can have us going inward. Just like the Jupiter last quarter squares to Saturn, we're at the max of manifesting something unless we're evolving it. Saturn last quarter squares to Neptune, we're at the max of understanding and evolving something unless we're really going inward deeply. Another one of those drawing lines in the sand or circles. And this one, there's a real deep need to hold hands, to come together. This is an aspect that is asking us to surrender to universal source. Jeffrey Green teachings used to say that the Saturn-Neptune planetary pair is the divine Neptune, discontent Saturn. Saturn is form. Neptune is formless. Saturn wants to have control over the manifestations in order to have security. And Neptune goes, the only thing that gives you security is source itself. And here's Neptune in Pisces. These aspects can see the whole climate change thing emphasized, religion emphasized. Again, name any area of social issues going on, and they can be emphasized with this. The whole message here is, can you broaden your understanding of natural law and align with universal truth in order to have inner peace in this world, regardless of how your outer circumstances and situations are changing? How well are you doing that? I did not include Saturn. I already showed you the nodal axis. I did include the U.S. election chart. This is a little slide that I had put together for a little local talk that I had done. It was a brief talk. I didn't get a lot of time, but I used a Gemini rising chart for July 4th, 1776, which is the 2:13 a.m. chart, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is the chart that Jeffrey Green used in his teachings. I also gravitated to this chart through the teachings of Robert Gover, G-O-V-E-R, who wrote the book Time and Money. He did a lot of research on the U.S. Charts, and he came through the understanding that our founding fathers were Freemasons, and they put these Cancer planets in the second house of resources. Again, founding framers of the Declaration of Independence didn't know about Pluto or Neptune or Uranus at the time that they declared independence. Jeffrey always felt that our country was at ninth house Pluto because of all of our religious issues. I like the financial issues that we've also been about. Probably the thing to recognize here is regardless of which chart you use on July 4th, Mars square to Neptune, Saturn square to Saturn, or excuse me, Sun square to Saturn. These two squares are this tension we have between including and excluding, be it racial, be it religious, be it financial, be it whatever way you look at it. And as we all know, we're getting closer and closer to Pluto, balsamic natal Pluto, and we're going to have the U.S. Pluto return 3 times in 2022. We have some other aspects that come along before that. Here's Saturn over here in Sagittarius. It'll be in the 7th house throughout this retrograde cycle. It's not having any dramatic specific aspects other than an inconjunct to the sun that'll be going on, a sextile to itself. To me, I've just looked more at the Saturn retrograde here in the 7th house with this chart, and all the communications that are going on in relationships on the broadest collective level, and this search of truth versus lying that is taking place so strongly here right now. You know, there are these other aspects that are going on that are part of it. And this is the election chart, the outer wheel, the opening of the polls. Jupiter will be in Libra to this natal Saturn in Libra right here. And, you know, just the polarity of stuff that we have going on in the country. I do not look at this presidential race to be a kumbaya moment of all of us coming together. What I said at my talk, we need to look at 2016, 2020, and 2024, all 4 of those U.S. presidential elections as being quite volatile. And, you know, who knows, possibly going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I do feel that it will most likely come down to Hillary and Donald. I do feel that it will probably be Hillary unless there's a lot of underhanded things that take place, because Trump is really alienating everything except white males. And so, but in regards to the Saturn retrograde, there's just a lot of, again, lies versus truth. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's the one I missed. This was it. The Saturn oppositions to Uranus at about 9 degrees Sag. Saturn goes retrograde back to 947, so it won't go all the way back. But as we look at Saturn turning direct in late August, August 13th, 947, it will be so tight within orb to this Uranus that, again, that whole theme of truth versus lies and how outrageous can we be and talking out of both sides of our mouth. I mean, there's no better reality TV right now going on. For those of us who are working to individuate and spiritualize, it's for us to walk this truth as best as we can. And when we are given opportunities to communicate, can you find the language to speak in the consensus world and say, what kind of values do we want to have in as a country? What kind of values do we want our leader to have? Do we want a diplomat? Do we want to start another war? You get my point. I probably don't have to repeat myself for any of you. So again, the Saturn retrograde in Sagittarius, it really is about throwing off any and all limited perceptions of personal truth and reaching for deeper understandings of universal truth through curiosity and open-mindedness. And any of you who are familiar with my teachings, I love asking questions because it invites an answer. How are you reaching for deeper understandings of truth? Where are you compensating or lying? Where do you go to excess? Where do you need flexibility? How do you need to be more honest? Where do you need to be more inclusive? You can take each of these statements and replace you with I. And just ask those statements in first person. You may have more that you want to ask. And this can lead the way in allowing you to really, open up to your own path of deeper truth and broader understandings and deepening that inner security of Saturn so that you can walk with greater security in this changing world that is out there, changing faster than we can keep up with sometimes. So here is a few more of the aspects with the synodic cycle between Sun and Saturn. Any synodic cycle is always a planetary cycle with the Sun. So I still go from conjunction to conjunction, but I put in the first and last quarter squares, and I put in the waxing and waning trines for you with these dates as well. And so those are all, this is my material throughout this class. Here are our future webinars. I said the Mars retrograde one will be April 13th. And again, we'll have a free Mercury retrograde, as we always do whenever Mercury's retrograde, April 25th. And for those of you who have been following our chakra series, here's the last in that series on the crown chakra and enlightenment. And so before closing, I would just like to see if anybody has any questions or comments on anything that I covered or anything that I may have forgotten to cover. Questions or comments? Questions or comments from Leroy? Did anything spark for you? All right. Looks like we've been a pretty quiet bunch. Listening. Gemini polarity. All right, everyone. Thank you very much. I hope this has been most helpful for you. And I wish you all the best on the evolution of your personal beliefs and your path to universal timeless truth. Thank you very much. Adios.